Okay. Before I get started, there's a film on here at 5:30, so when I'm done, give me a chance to pack up, and if you have questions or comments, maybe I'll do that outside the theater so they can get set up for that. And of course, I've talked a little bit about MacArthur in some of my earlier lectures, so unless you've read some of the biographies written about MacArthur, you're probably going to get most of your impressions about him from what I said. But I'm going to say more about him. And like I said, he's a very complex and individual. So what I told you earlier might give you one impression of him, but what I'm going to tell you about him today might even give you a slightly different impression. So going back to a previous lecture, when I said even the people who knew him didn't understand him because he was so complex, and hopefully you'll walk away with that feeling too before I'm done. But I want to, before I go much further into the lecture, this is a quote from General MacArthur. After he was ordered out of the Philippines by the President of the United States, made his way down to Australia. He held his first press conference when he arrived in Adelaide. Well, he was greeted by cheering crowds because he was being seen as the savior of Australia, being that they only had their militia. They didn't have much of an air force or a navy, and most of their fighting men were off in the Middle East and North Africa, with the exception of the 8th Australian Division, which was in Australia, or which was in Singapore. And Singapore would soon fall, and of course that entire division would become prisoners of war. But when he held his news conference, he said something to the effect that the president has ordered me out of the Philippines to organize our allies here in Australia, and I have ordered out of the Philippines, but I shall return. But actually, he really had no right to say that because he's not the one who decided how the war was going to be fought. These decisions were made by higher ups, people like Winston Churchill and the President of the United States, plus their collective military chiefs of staff who were working constantly together, mainly the British and Americans, deciding how the war would be prosecuted. And of course, in the early days of the war, a lot of our assets, and we didn't have a lot of assets, were being sent first to North Africa and then Sicily, Italy, and of course we had the big buildup in the United Kingdom for the planned liberation of Europe. So he wasn't getting a lot, and he had no right to say that he would return to the Philippines because that had to be decided later. As a matter of fact, as he made progress in Papua New Guinea, and we're also making progress in the Solomon Islands, and he was getting closer to the Philippines, they had to make a decision as to whether he would, in fact, be allowed to return to the Philippines. Now, Admiral Ernest King, who was Chief of Naval Operations, didn't like Douglas MacArthur to begin with. He didn't think it was necessary for him to return to the Philippines. He thought it would be better if they bypassed the Philippines altogether and instead took over Taiwan, because that would put the Allies closer to the Japanese home islands. There were even some people, I guess, in the Pentagon who suggested maybe we should go into mainland China. Of course, when I read this, I was thinking, well, if you bypass the Philippines and go up to Taiwan, you still have all those Japanese troops and their airplanes and their ships below him, plus all the assets that the Japanese had on the Chinese mainland. I think it would have been a very difficult task. Now, President Roosevelt at one point asked MacArthur to come back to the States so they could have a meeting. MacArthur and him and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Marshall and Ernest King, so they could work this out, what was the best route to take. Well, MacArthur, I mean, if you can believe this, arguing with the President of the United States, said, well, I'm just too busy here. I can't really take the time off to go back and see you. Well, the President of the United States, he said, well, he had to work this out, so he came up with a compromise. The President of the United States, who couldn't walk, was in a wheelchair. He actually came out to Hawaii and asked MacArthur, please, meet me halfway, meet me in Hawaii. Ernest King had his lieutenant, Admiral Nimitz, already in Hawaii to argue in his stead. But as I've read in several history books, even though Admiral Nimitz was supposed to argue for Taiwan on behalf of Ernest King. He really was more sympathetic with MacArthur's plans to return to the Philippines. So they met in Hawaii. They presented their cases. MacArthur argued that we have a moral obligation to return to the Philippines and liberate them, since they had been under brutal Japanese occupation for well over 2 years by the stage. So it was the President of the United States who voted in favor of MacArthur. So he was, in the end, allowed to keep his promise to the Philippine people and return to the Philippines. And I used this map at the end of my last lecture because the Japanese had determined by then, since they were being pushed back on almost all fronts, except maybe on the Chinese mainland, they'd been pushed out of Guadalcanal. The Allies were advancing further up the Solomon Chains in the direction of Rabaul in New Britain. The Japanese had pretty much concluded, though, that if they lost Papua New Guinea and allowed the United States to invade the Philippine Islands, also if they lost their main base in Truk in the Central Pacific, and especially if they lost Saipan, then the war was good as over. In fact, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, when the Marianas finally fell, General Tojo, who's also Prime Minister, and his entire cabinet were forced to resign. And that's why the Marine Corps history of the Battle of Saipan was called the beginning of the end, because that, in fact, is what it was. So originally now, the plan, even though it was laid out early on, it went through a number of revisions. And at the time, both General MacArthur and the Joint Chiefs of Staff had concluded that if they were going to have any success in reducing Japanese power in this part of the world, allowing him to get back the Philippines, they would have to actually invade Rabaul, because that was the biggest Japanese naval and air base in that part of the Pacific. As a matter of fact, it was ships and planes coming down from Rabaul that almost came close to pushing the Marines off of Guadalcanal in the early days of the fighting there. But they finally concluded after a while, and MacArthur agreed with the Joint Chiefs of Staff that taking Rabaul would take up too much time. It would take up too many men. It'd take up a lot of material, because they had about 90,000 troops up there in New Britain, and most of them were concentrated around Rabaul. They had a number of air bases up there. They had become troglodytes. They had dug into the mountains, and they were fully expecting the Allies to try and take Rabaul. So they came up with an alternate plan. They would cut off Rabaul and prevent it from being a threat to them as MacArthur moved further up the coast of Papua New Guinea in the direction of the Philippines. So what they did is they took select islands in the Solomons, not all of them. They even went so far as Bougainville, but it's a big island. They didn't want to get bogged down in there by trying to take the entire island. Stop and take a breath. Okay. So they decided just to take parts of Bougainville where they could put down airstrips, and they also took little islands like the 3rd New Zealand Division took the Treasury Islands, the Shortland Islands. They also secured Green Islands. They had air bases there on the Green Islands, part of Bougainville, and from there they could constantly bomb and strafe the assets that the Japanese had in Rabaul. They went even further. They went up to, the Marines took Imaru Island and found there were no Japanese up there. So that was one of the islands that they took without having to take any casualties. And then they went all the way around to the Admiralty Islands, Los Negros and Manus, and secured those. So basically Rabaul was surrounded. They were under constant aerial attack. Eventually, the Japanese finally gave up. What few ships and planes they had left, they pulled out and sent it to other parts of the Pacific. Some of them went up to Chuuk Island in the central part of the Pacific. So they saved a lot of time. They saved a lot of money and material by doing that rather than taking Rabaul as originally planned. Now, by this time, too, Buna and Gona had been secured. MacArthur was starting to make some progress. He's moving up the northwest coast of Papua New Guinea. He was getting up to Lae, and One of the concerns, though, was the western end of New Britain, because there were Japanese down there. They wanted to secure at least the western end of New Britain so that MacArthur and his troops and his ships could move up through the Vitez Straits without having to worry about being hit by the Japanese there. So they had a airborne unit that went into Arawa, where you see the arrow there, on 15 December, and then the 1st Marine Division, who had been on R&R in Australia for a while, they took Cape Gloucester, but they just secured the western end and held it so that the Japanese couldn't cause any trouble. But I found out later, though, that there was some other activity in New Britain. No books have been written about it, but I came across some material in Australian archives. They had the 4th Australian Division. They ponied up with what was called a small boat and an engineering unit, which was American. They were just using a small landing craft, and they were making incursions up and down the coast just to see where the Japanese were. General Imamura, who was in charge of all the troops there, suspected that maybe they were trying to fool him into thinking that a big landing was going to take place further down west. So he'd send out patrols to keep an eye on what they were doing, but then he kept most of his troops in Rabaul, still thinking that there was going to be a landing up there, which, of course, never took place. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Admiralty Islands. Manus, Los Negros, and especially Sea Adler Harbor, because the Japanese were there. They put up a fight, but they didn't put up as big a fight as they did, say, in Guadalcanal and some of the other places. So once they secured that, they realized that Sea Adler Harbor would make a great supply and support base. And so that's what they did. They turned it in. It was just it was a very natural harbor, quite big. They even brought in 2 floating dry docks. Now, these floating dry docks were built on the west coast of the United States in sections, and then they were towed out to Sea Adler Harbor, as well as other parts of the Pacific, too, and then they were welded together. And these things were big enough to take battleships, and they had 2 of them there. Now, even though the Japanese had pulled out most of their aircraft and ships out of Rabaul, there were still 90,000 military personnel tied up there. And some of these aviation machinist mates, maybe they got bored, but they had a number of wrecked torpedo planes there. And some of these Japanese machinist mates cannibalized some of these torpedo planes and managed to make 2 of them flyable. Plus, they had a supply of torpedoes there. So they decided, once they got those 2 torpedo planes flyable, they attacked Sea Adler Harbor at night. Now, at this stage in the war, they were working around the clock repairing damaged ships. And the idea of having these floating dry docks and these support bases that close to where the action was, that damaged ships could be repaired there and sent right back into action. Unless they were so severely damaged, they might have to be sent back to Pearl Harbor or even the west coast. But these 2 Japanese torpedo planes flew in there at night. One of them just disappeared. It didn't do any damage, but one of them saw one of the floating dry docks lit up like a Christmas tree, and he thought it was an aircraft carrier, so he sank it. And one of the people I did an oral history interview was Bob Atabadi. He was a signalman. He had served on a hospital ship at Pearl Harbor and continued to serve on it through part of the war. And then he was transferred to one of these floating dry docks. And he thought he was being punished because he thought he was a pretty good signalman, and he thought he should be more involved in the war. But they treated these floating dry docks as if they were a ship, as part of the fleet. In fact, it was a four-striper, a captain, who commanded each one of these floating dry docks, and he thought there must have been something wrong with that captain to be assigned to a floating dry dock instead of a real fighting ship. But the remains of the one that was sunk is still there in Sea Adler Harbor. I was just there a few months ago on an expedition-type ship, but they wouldn't let me go to any of the World War II sites because the focus of this expedition-type cruise was all about culture and animals, and I was a Pacific War historian, so they wanted to go out and show people birds and spiders and snakes and stuff like that. So I was kind of left out in the cold there. But this is also in Sea Adler Harbor. Has anybody ever heard of the USS Mount Hood? Nobody's ever heard of that? If a U.S. Navy ship blew up and killed everybody on board of it, you think you'd know about it today? Yeah, well, this is what happened. That's the USS Mount Hood right there. Of course, during the war, thousands of ships were being sunk, millions of people were being killed, entire cities were being wiped off the face of the earth. So I suppose when one ship blew up, for whatever reason, it might make page 5 in the newspapers. I don't know. But this was an ammunition ship. Something went wrong. We don't know what happened. But it didn't just blow up. It vaporized. Killed everybody on the ship except for a 17-man a working party that was ashore that day. Be interesting if they were still around to find them and get their oral histories. But if you look real close, it's not the best photograph, but you can see ships down there towards the bottom. That's how big the explosion was. Not only did it kill everybody on the ship, but it killed and injured people on other ships in the near vicinity, and also caused damage to quite a few of those ships. Now, they closed down that base at the end of World War II, like we did a lot of ships throughout, or bases throughout the Pacific. The war was over. Japan was no longer a threat. There's no point in keeping these bases open. But more recently, the United States and Australia have gone back in to the Admiralty Islands, and they are now turning it into a base again. And the reason for it is because of the threat from China. Not only there, but they have a Marine Corps training base outside of Darwin. The president of the Palau Islands has asked the United States and their allies to come back and use the Palau Islands as a support base, because they're also afraid of some of the intentions that China appear to have for the Asia-Pacific area. So this is the base now. It's called Lam Brun Naval Base, and they've started building it up, and there's going to be airstrips and all sorts of other facilities in case something does happen in that part of the Pacific. Now, a lot of what the success that MacArthur and the Allies had to do with intelligence, because we had the code breakers who really helped MacArthur in knowing where Japanese concentrations were and how to avoid getting tangled up in a big battle like they had in Buna and Gona. But they also had photo recon, but that was limited because you're dealing with a jungle environment, and aerial photographs didn't always provide the information you wanted. And General Willoughby, who was MacArthur's intelligence officer, had this habit of getting the intelligence wrong more often than not. But he was loyal to MacArthur, and that was one of the reasons he kept him there. So they came up with another way of getting intelligence. It was the Alamo Scouts. This was put together by General Kruger, who was from Texas, and I guess because since he was Texas, he decided to call this commando group the Alamo Scouts. And they were specially trained volunteers. They weren't, and they were trained, and they would be put in behind Japanese lines, and not to cause any trouble, but really to stay out of sight and gather intelligence. By being on the ground, maybe they could see where maybe some of their supply dumps are, or where concentrations of Japanese troops were. I mean, they were so well trained and so effective in what they did. They only lost 2 people from the Alamo Scouts during the entire war, and they were lost during a training exercise. So anyway, Buna and Gona are part of the past. He's making progress. They wanted to take Leh. The reason they wanted to take Leh, it was one of the larger towns in the area. Plus, it was very close to Nadzap, where the Japanese had built an airstrip. But they wanted the airstrip so they could expand on it. The thing is, the Japanese were pretty fearful that the Japanese or the Allies would land there too. So what they did, they tried to fool the Japanese into thinking that MacArthur and the Americans and the Australians were actually going to land in Salamoa, just to the south. So they did a lot of bombing and shelling there. That convinced the Japanese that that's where the Allies were going to land next. As a result, most of the troops that were in Leh shifted down to Salamoa. Once they got down there, the Allies took Leh without too much problem. And then they used the 7th and 9th Australian Divisions and the 503rd, I guess, what were they? PIR. I forgot what that stands for. Paratroop? Okay, well, anyway. But what they did is they parachuted in there. They took Nasdaq with a minimum of casualties, and then really expanded. It was one of the hugest air bases in that part of the world, and it was used right up until the end of the war. I put this green arrow in because a little village of Seal, and the reason that's important is because the code breakers had had a lot of success in breaking the Japanese naval codes, but they had not had any success in breaking the Japanese army codes. So some Australians who were in Xiao with minesweepers, they were looking for mines, they came across a metal box. The Japanese had dumped all of their code books in there as they tried to escape the advancing Allies. And they came across this box, and it had all the Japanese Army code. So that was immediately turned over to the code breakers, and that made it even easier for MacArthur and the Allies to make further success as the war progressed. Now, there was somebody in MacArthur's staff, I think it was Brigadier General Feller, I think his name was, Anyway, he was one of the lower downs in MacArthur's group, but he just did the math one day. And he went to MacArthur and he says, you know, at the rate we're going, it's going to take at least 4 years for us to get back to the Philippines, let alone Japan. We're going to have to find a way of maybe speeding up the process of pushing the Japanese back so that you can get back to the Philippines. So they decided that they were going to skip some of the planned landings and try to make bigger leaps forward. Now, the Japanese had abandoned Madang, and we bypassed Wewak and Hansa Bay, which is just to the west of between the two green arrows. Now, by this time, though, MacArthur was getting more in the way of troops and aircraft and ships. He started to have a real navy. His Air Force now had B-24s, B-38s, and other more modern aircraft that would allow him to take the war further along the coast. And so he had B-24s, which had a longer range and could carry a bigger bomb load than the B-17s, and they also had some P-38s. Now, they also brought Charles Lindbergh out there. Now, Charles Lindbergh had fallen out of favor because he was one of the leading lights in the America First movement who were dedicated to not getting involved in another European war or any foreign war of any other kind. I think he was in the Air Force Reserves at one point, but after Pearl Harbor, you know, he completely flipped and he wanted to be involved in the war effort, but Roosevelt just couldn't stand the guy and just pushed him away until later on in the war, because then he was sent out there and he was showing the pilots how they could get a greater range out of their P-38s by adjusting the fuel somehow. I'm not an aviator, so I don't know any of the details there. Plus, they had disposable fuel tanks that would even increase their range. So, and the Japanese had realized that MacArthur was making these incremental steps up the north coast of Papua New Guinea. He would only go as far as he had air cover. So they would sort of pretty much guess where he was going to land next. But with the B-24s and the P-38s flying as escorts, they decided that they were going to make a giant leap all the way to Atapi and Hollandia, which is just to the left of the other green arrow. The Japanese had a big supply and support base there, a lot of warehouses, a lot of equipment, food, and everything else they needed to sustain the fight against the Allies. But thinking that the Allies were going to land somewhere to the east of that, all of their troops that were in Hollandia were sent marching in that direction. And after they did that, then General Kenny's 5th Air Force launched an attack with the B-24s, pulverized the place, and then the Army, the 41st Division, landed with hardly any opposition. So here we are in Hollandia, and as a result, it was, like I said in a previous lecture, I said there's certain battles you're never going to read about. There's not going to be any books written about it, and Hollywood's not going to make any movies about it because they were so well conducted, there were so few casualties, there was nothing exciting to write about. Not like Iwo Jima, where you had 25,000 Marine Corps casualties. Sure, they're going to write books until the last dog dies, and Hollywood's probably going to produce some more movies about Iwo Jima, but nobody's going to write a book or make a movie about Hollandia because once they secured Hollandia, the total casualties were fewer than 200 killed and a little over 1,000 wounded. And so it just really moved up his timetable. So here we are, and we're by May of, that would be 1944. He's all the way up to Biak Island, right towards the western tip of Papua New Guinea. But he got bogged down there because his intelligence officer, General Willoughby, said there were probably no more than a few thousand Japanese on the island. And they had sent photo reconnaissance missions over there. They sent airplanes over there. No anti-aircraft fire, no sign of life at all. But what the Japanese were doing is they were hiding in all of these limestone caves there. And of course, Biak is covered with jungle. So of course, this photo reconnaissance mission would come back saying, hey, doesn't look like there's much there. So when the troops did land there, 41st Division again, they ran into a hellstorm of resistance from the Japanese. Matter of fact, he came quite close to being pushed off the beach there. And it took, instead of seizing it in a few days or a few weeks, they ended up fighting, trying to seize that over several months. In fact, they had to take a little island just off to the west of Biak to build an airstrip to help in reducing the Japanese there. Now, I was in Biak a few months ago with this expedition ship. So one of the things they wanted to do was go see this huge cave where, according to the historians, the history books I've read, I don't know how they got the count, but this is this huge natural limestone cave, and supposedly there were something like 3,000 Japanese troops in there, okay? So American troops managed to find a big hole or a gap in the top of where the cave was, and they poured down diesel and AV gas, barrels of it, and then set it off with high explosives. And they ended up incinerating 3,000 Japanese troops that were in there. The conflagration was such that actually the roof of the cave fell in. And that's what you're looking at there. You're looking at the cave, and I'm guessing that there's still Japanese soldiers buried under the tons of rubble there. But you can see the opening in the roof. This was taken back in the 1990s when I was there. But more recently, now they have stairs that go down there. It's quite the tourist attraction. And of course, all around the area, and not just in Papua New Guinea, but throughout the Pacific, if you go out in the jungle, you're going to find some of the detritus from the war still there. This is what was still there in the 90s, but in recent years, collectors have gone into these areas and tried to take these things out because there's money to be made. We also came across skeletal remains of Japanese who had died there. And now, finally, in October of 44, MacArthur got his wish. He returned to the Philippines. It's October 44. They made landings on Leyte. The Japanese realized that if the Americans were allowed to secure and hold Leyte, then the rest of the Philippines would eventually be taken. So they sent all of their naval assets in the area and tried to break it up. It was so they sent a southern force in. They were heading for the Surigao Straits. It was just to the south end of Leyte. Another force came, second strike force came from the north, and then Admiral Kurita came in through the San Bernardino Straits just north of the Samar Islands. Now, we knew they were coming. The submarines that were out warned that there was a huge Japanese naval presence heading for Leyte. The submarines tried to disrupt these ships as much as they could. PT boats got into the act, destroyers got into the act, but waiting right across the Surigao Straits were a bunch of battleships and cruisers. A lot of them, such as the USS California, had been sunk at Pearl Harbor. And now, they were sunk at Pearl Harbor, but they were raised, they were patched up, and they were sent back out to the war. So some of these ships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor were there at Surigao, and when the Japanese ships got there, basically they crossed the T. In other words, the Japanese were coming like this, and all they had was their forward batteries on their ships that they could use, but the American ships had crossed the T. That's what they call crossing the T. So all of their batteries could concentrate on the Japanese coming at them and basically just wipe them out. Very few got out. A lot of the Japanese survivors who managed to swim ashore were then executed by Filipinos who were waiting for them on the beach. In the meantime, up here in the San Bernardino Strait, Admiral Halsey was there with his carriers and his battleships and cruisers, and he was supposed to be guarding the San Bernardino Straits because there was a fear that maybe the Japanese would come through there and try to disrupt the landings on Leyte. Well, the Japanese had a ploy. They had a few carriers left, but they had very few airplanes. They had very few qualified pilots. But they made it known that they were going to sail down here and try to disrupt the landings on Leyte too. Now, Halsey's orders were not to leave the San Bernardino Straits unguarded, but he took the bait of the Japanese carriers. He left the San Bernardino Straits completely open. He didn't leave any battleships or cruisers or anything. He took the whole task force up there. Of course, he sank a number of aircraft carriers and other ships, but in the meantime, Admiral Kurita managed to get through the San Bernardino Straits and was heading for Leyte. All we had was a couple of jeep carriers and destroyers and destroyer escorts and a few aircraft who were trying to stop them or at least slow them down, because if they had made it all the way down to Leyte, that could have put a real crimp in MacArthur's plans. They could have literally just destroyed all the efforts that he had put into landing on Leyte. But for whatever reason, Kurita survived the war, and when they interviewed him, he said he'd been for several days without sleep. That may have affected his judgment. But he sank a couple of jeep carriers, some destroyers, destroyer escorts, who were fired all their torpedoes and all their guns, but they kept making fake runs at the ships, hoping they would turn away and at least slow them down. A lot of them end up being sunk. But almost within reach of Leyte, though, for whatever reason, Kurita turned around and headed back through the San Bernardino Straits, basically saving MacArthur's bacon. And again, when Kurita was interviewed after the war, he said one of his concerns was that Halsey would have, by that time, would have turned around and he would have been trapped. But Halsey just was so far up north he couldn't get away. He was highly criticized, Halsey was, after that. And there's a lot of books and articles written about that, so I don't want to get too much into that. But one of the people I interviewed, too, was Peter Kennedy. He was about 90 when I interviewed him, but he was in the 9th Australian Division. He was at the Battle of El Alamein. He was there with two of his brothers, who also fought in the 9th Division there in North Africa. Now, these divisions, as the war progressed, and the Allies had more and more troops in North Africa and eventually in England, a lot of these divisions were released and to come down and help the Allies in the push to get rid of the Japanese in the area. And they picked up a fourth brother when they were back in Australia. So there were four brothers in the 9th Division. However, their next the landings that they would make would be on Borneo. They had been fighting in the deserts all this time, so they were sent up to North Queensland to get jungle training. And he said the worst part about the jungle training were the leeches up there. Because he said during the training, if you just stopped for a minute, you could see the leeches coming up out of the grass trying to get to you. And if you tried to sleep or take a nap out there, they would crawl in your nose and in your ears. And he said it was worse there than it was in Borneo. But the thing about Borneo is that was one of the objectives of the Japanese after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, because that was one of the nearest petroleum fields, as well as the petroleum fields that were in Sumatra. But by this time, though, all the facilities in Borneo and Sumatra had been bombed into oblivion. They really couldn't get much oil out of the ground. At the same time, American submarines were off the coast of Borneo, all the way up through the South China Sea, all the way up to Japan. So even if they could get the oil out of Sumatra and Borneo, most of it never made it back to Japan because American submarines were sinking most of their tankers. So it was kind of a wasted effort. But at the same time, they're taking casualties. And for whatever reason, MacArthur did not want Australian troops to participate in the liberation of the Philippines. He wanted only U.S. troops to participate. Having said that, though, there were elements of the Australian Navy, such as HMAS Australia, who were part of the the American fleet when they went to the Philippines, and there were also some Australian aircraft squadrons that are involved, but for whatever reason, he didn't want Australian ground troops involved. I better really back up a little bit. At the same time, the Australian troops were kept busy mopping up a lot of Japanese stragglers that were in Papua New Guinea and places like Borneo. The thing is, they were not being reinforced, the Japanese. They were not being resupplied. They were dying of hunger and disease. They were just trying to find food, and yet these Australian troops were trying to push them even harder. In fact, I thought it was MacArthur's idea that they stay behind, but more recently I read that it was what was the Australian general? Thomas, forgot his name. Help me out. Huh? Yeah, Blamey. Thomas Blamey. I read that he was the one who insisted on the troops still trying to mop up in there. And there was actually talk in the Australian Parliament of passing a resolution ordering Australian troops home because they knew the war was almost over. But by being sent out there to mop up starving and diseased Japanese, they were still taking casualties. Matter of fact, some years ago when I gave this lecture, a fellow from the audience came forward. He was part of ANGAO. That's the Australian-New Zealand administrative unit that had administrative control over Papua New Guinea before they gained independence. And he said it was back in the early 1960s when he was there. And he said a villager, a nearby villager came forward to him and he said, there's a Japanese soldier living in his village nearby. This is the 1960s. So he went over to the village, found the guy. He says, the war's been over for 15 years. You can go home now. And he says, well, I have nothing to go home to. I was taken in by this village. I married a local girl. I have children here. This is my home now. And apparently there were a lot of situations where these starving and diseased Japanese just wandered off into the jungle. And some of these villages took them in and tried to help them out. So who knows how many Japanese ended up spending the rest of their lives living in some village there in Papua New Guinea. So by the time we get to towards the end of the war, he started off with not much of a navy, not much of an air force. He had 2 National Guard units. He had some Australian militia units. Eventually, some more Australian divisions were brought in from North Africa to help out. So, but by the time we get towards the end of the war, MacArthur had something like 340,000 U.S. troops under his command. He had about 10,000 Australians, and then there were some Dutch, and there were some Melanesian troops who were also fighting with the Allies. Of course, these numbers may look kind of large here, but it compares nothing to the assets we had in Europe at that time. And we had millions of men in Europe just waiting for D-Day to start, not counting the troops we had involved in Sicily and Italy. So he had a much bigger force to deal with towards the end of the war, but it certainly didn't compare with anything that we had in Europe. But I like this map because it kind of marks how far he went in less than 4 years. He started off, he was in Adelaide, he set up his base in Brisbane, and eventually moved it up to Port Moresby, eventually to Hollandia, and then during the latter part of the campaign, as he got in the Philippines, his headquarters, for the most part, was on various ships as they moved in the Philippine Islands. So even though he probably didn't do a very good job in the early part of the war, he certainly muffed up things in the Philippines, and for whatever reason, he was given a chance, and I think he proved himself. Now, after Buna and Gona, where he got tied down for a couple of months and was taking casualties, from that point on, I think he learned from his mistakes, and he made up for it. And I think he did, in my estimation, given the limited number of assets that he did a pretty good job. And in a previous lecture, you probably can't remember back that far, but I gave you some ideas to casualties he took compared to casualties in other theaters of the war, mainly in Europe, and they were quite minimal. But once he got into the Philippines and started fighting there, his casualties started mounting. As a matter of fact, his combat casualties are almost equivalent to the number of casualties that we suffered in the battle for Okinawa. But more importantly, whether it was Allied troops or Japanese troops, if you look at the bottom line, our casualties were pretty high if you take in consideration that a lot of people were taken out of combat due to things like tropical diseases, dysentery, dengue fever, malaria. I mean, that was probably the biggest obstacle that all of the armies had to deal with in fighting in the tropics. It was the disease that really decimated the ranks, and they had to constantly be replaced. Now, the Japanese losses, from what I've been able to glean, and I'm always a bit suspicious of numbers I come up with, but the IJA lost almost 500,000 people there just in the Papua New Guinea campaign, and the Navy lost almost as many. So, and I wanted to show these planes here because I've talked about the gunships and skip bombing. Well, this is a B-25 Mitchell, and you can see how machine guns were mounted there in the nose to use them as a gunship. But some of those B-25s had a lot more machine guns in the nose than what you see in that photograph. A-20 Havoc likewise. And I'd read that the British-built Beaufighters, some of those were turned into gunships as well. Oh, and that's the end of my lecture for today. Anyway, that's it. And if you have any questions or comments, maybe you can meet me outside because they need to set this up for the film. And tomorrow I'm going to talk about the Guadalcanal, the rest of the story, which is a bit of a misnomer because what I'm actually talking about is New Caledonia and the New Hebrides, which is now known as Vanuatu, because that was a big supply and support base that made victory in Guadalcanal possible, and I will go into that tomorrow. So thank you for attending.